It is with great pleasure that I introduce to you tonight Sean Penn, an American film icon. Help me. Many of you know Sean Penn as a two-time Academy Award-winning actor, director, and writer. But what I do also know about Sean Penn and most appreciate about him is his identity outside of Hollywood. Sean Penn is a unique actor and a true gentleman. He can inhabit the character of a voracious, double-dealing lawyer, a death row inmate moment before execution, an outspoken gay rights activist, a man with severe mental disability, and the fit and thoughtful astronauts traveling to Mars. His works offer us a collage of who we are and what we are capable of, and so does his life. It's not easy to embrace issues of social and political injustice, especially when one is famous, because we live in a culture where our public persona and reputation are highly protected. Placing our image on the line put only our livelihood at risk, but that of our loved ones. So there's almost no way to overstate my appreciation and our appreciation for what Sean has done and continues to do. This man actively seeks out ways to listen and to help others. His first public intervention in the world of politics and humanitarian issues happened in 2002, when he published an open letter to President W. George Bush in the Washington Post, condemning the prefabricated evidence adapted to launch a heinous war on Iraq. 4.5 years later, he followed up with another letter in which he called Bush, Cheney, and Condoleezza Rice villainously and criminally obscene people. Being a man of action, not only words, Sean personally gone twice to Baghdad in 2002 and 2003, risking his own life to get a first-hand look at the plight and suffering of the occupied Iraqi people. Next, Sean was one of the few Americans who traveled to New Orleans for something other than Mardi Gras. When Hurricane Katrina hit, President Bush Jr. condescended to fly over the stricken city while in the comfort of Air Force One. But Sean Penn literally drove into the fray, commandeered a motorboat, and began rescuing local victims and residents from their ruined homes, even when it meant getting soaked up to his chest in toxic sludge and debris, risking his own life in the process. In 2012, after a catastrophic earthquake struck Haiti, Sean ventured into the simmering hot streets of the capital, Port-au-Prince, choked with dust and rubble, investing not only his money and time, but his safety as well, rescuing and helping thousands of victims. I have personally seen him in the field, in action, when the global war of terrorism on Syria broke out. Sean and I sat and discussed on numerous occasions what could possibly be done so as not to repeat the international blunder made in Iraq. He and I walked the streets of Damascus, and even while mortar shells were being dropped just a block away, and he didn't even flinch. As a matter of fact, he was more nervous and concerned while sampling the delicious hand-pounded ice cream at the Hamidiyya Bazaar, telling me, these are the real bombs. Martin Luther King once said that our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. Well, Sean Penn doesn't believe in remaining comfortable and detached, living in the bubble of a celebrity. He believed that history has always been the graveyard of the oppressed. Sean believed and demonstrated that the ultimate measure of a man's value is where he stands at times of social challenges and controversy. With this level of bravery, integrity, and selflessness, Sean inspires me as a caring citizen and as a social leader. He also inspired me as a friend, This was a man who I can attest that can bring into any room he walks in an open mind, a profound ability, and most of all, a warm heart. Well, having now exhausted my supply of struggling eloquence, it is my utmost pleasure to introduce to you my friend, our community friends and greatest ally and inspirations, Sean Penn.
Thank you. Thank you. Forgive me, I have to just get my equilibrium contextually after all these over-generous words tonight. What shithole countries y'all from? Honestly, it has been hard to assume how and where to begin. So that levity is at my own peril. If I start crying, don't worry about me. It's not because I'm bipolar or sleep deprived, and it's not because I'm the most bullied person on the planet. It's just simply a compulsion of age. I'm very privileged to be here tonight. Some might say too privileged, and that would be true in many ways. Not the least of which is that you are allowing my voice to be heard. Still, I think the most privileged of us struggle to have clarity and purpose in such maddening times as these. Maddening and tragic weather events, maddening murder, state-sponsored and otherwise. The Oval Office riffs of a red-hatted rapper, and what often seems our increasing cultural appetite for simple-minded zealotry. Healthy skepticism, intellectual curiosity, and in fact, any layered human discourse are under constant assault by 140-character personal advertisement boards. It at times feels impossible for any individual voice to resonate in question of authority, trends, branded movements, even more difficult to identify and land an optimism of substance. But I'm going to give it a go. I speak here tonight in gratitude to the history and the courageous sacrifice of ADC on behalf of human rights that owns a formidable and humbling legacy, proving also that the promotion of cultural heritage and assimilation are not mutually exclusive. I come here tonight as one almost pathologically wary of groups, movements, lobbies, or any trends that may serve as an engine of zealotry. I'm particularly wary of any church, temple, or mosque that might seek to separate us from individual human thought in the name of religion. It seems to me that it has been the tolerant diversity of thought and belief within your organization that has established its long, proud history in the defense of civil rights, extending far beyond an isolated or myopic Arab American action group to those inalienable rights that belong to each and every human among us. Many of you will likely not agree with some of my perspectives, but I trust that you will consider them as I pledge to continually consider those in opposition. The American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, while the words naming the organization suggests an endlessly broad platform. I feel inclined to, as much as possible, isolate my remarks to the increasingly elusive idea that is indicated by that first word, American. I'd like you to imagine it's January 2010. You're standing in the streets of Port-au-Prince, Haiti. Hundreds of thousands are dead and dying in a city that's reduced to rubble. The United States government, the people of the United States, you and I, under the leadership of then President Barack Obama, immediately sent to that island nation 22,000 of our extraordinary soldiers into what could only be called the most robust, logistically sound, and compassionately humanitarian military operation in modern times. For those of us U.S. civilians, forgive me, I'm reading this, but it is late in the hour. For those of us U.S. civilians who witnessed and worked alongside these soldiers, it was an extraordinarily proud moment to be American. Their contribution, those men and women in uniform, in their partnership with our Haitian brothers and sisters, represented our country at its very best. Our forces had begun to arrive within hours of the quake. The port and airport had been so severely damaged and rendered useless by the earthquake to receive necessary relief following that disaster were immediately repaired and resourced by those American forces. The USS Comfort medical ship had been deployed to Haiti only 6 days after the earthquake, and that vessel of 250 beds with highly trained surgeons treated nearly 900 of those most devastatingly injured over the weeks that followed. The goodwill of the American people had lent our country's compassionate hand to people of that foreign country, a separate, sovereign, island nation in need. In 2017, another island was hit by a devastating natural disaster, Puerto Rico, an island of Americans like you and I. But this time, we, the American people, and our government under the leadership of President Donald Trump, saw 8 full days pass before a fraction of the Haitian deployment, a mere 4,100 U.S. troops, would respond to the needs of those our fellow citizens. At the height of our military's deployment to Puerto Rico, we never rose to half the troop levels I saw with my own eyes in Haiti. The Puerto Rican deployment has proven itself an historically insufficient one, incapable of rising to the needs of the Puerto Rican people or the territory's decimated infrastructure, allowing for an untold and cruel wave of unnecessary death, suffering, and continuing insufficient support. Why? What had changed? Was it the commitment of our troops that had changed? The excellence of their logistical prowess? It was neither, of course. It was us. We'd changed. It seems that these last few years, we've entered in our culture a period of exponential regression. Regression of language, civility, humanitarian conviction, and racial tolerance. We're a culture shifting, shaking, and on the verge of breaking. Sorry, I got 2 kids. We're a culture whose dwindling knowledge of basic civics leaves it to mainstream news outlets, or worse, retweeted misinformation campaigns to inform and reform us. Media outlets that so often succumb to a ratings-driven balancing act where information and entertainment make increasingly blurry bedfellows in their fulfillment of a 24-hour news cycle. One so fraught with speculative opinion that even when a dedicated journalist does break real news, when the facts are presented, our minds are so numb that many of us become vulnerable to their dismissal. networks prone to rely not on experts in the field of discussion, but rather on political pundits who appear either as apologists or critics on subjects requiring experience and knowledge outside their wheelhouse. I take you back to the deployment of the USS Comfort, which had embarked on its mission only 6 days after Haiti's earthquake. I was watching CNN recently, and on a debate panel over U.S. response in Puerto Rico was a Republican National Committee operator. It had been a full 2 weeks before the Comfort had been deployed in support of the devastated Americans in Puerto Rico. And by the time it had come and gone, it had only treated 290 patients of significant need or injury. The pundit defended the administration's response, suggesting there was, quote, no way for the ship to come into port, condescendingly reminding us that Puerto Rico is an island and that its port had been destroyed, suggesting it had nowhere to dock. He lacked the knowledge of even the most rudimentary, that the USS Comfort has this newfangled thing. And I know it takes great technical knowledge to imagine this. It's a high-tech device called an anchor. This amazing new technology where you drop a weighted prong on a chain to the seafloor and it steadies the vessel in position. It seems to me not simply an absence of knowledge or common sense, and not just the cynical spin either. Something more insidious, an example of increasing blindness and human detachment owned by those who've forgotten we are in a country of immigrants, white, brown, and black, and therefore, when considering the plights of non-whites, make up nonsense in lieu of consciousness. They forget, and in some cases, never knew, that our country was built not only on the backs of our founding fathers, but on those exploited African slaves, decimated Indian tribes, brown men and women working our fields of grain, Chinese land railroad track, and all those other seekers and slaves whose generations of progeny have more than earned their complete right of title as Americans. Now, presumably, I have been asked here to address issues of discrimination. So why am I bringing the logistical faux pas of pundit inadequacies to the floor? I do it because I see a relationship between the seismic shift of our country's breakdown of its faith in the Fourth Estate and the impact and influence of that on our own clear-mindedness. The consistent noise of speculative chatter is part of the psychological anesthetizing of thought that creates fertile ground for discriminatory behaviors, legislations, or lack of protective ones. So many of us were reduced to watching slack-jawed as parents and children are separated in dispassionate, illegal, and political haste and bureaucratic appeasement. Bans and borders boasted as if containments of cattle, while filial dynastic leaderships here and in Saudi Arabia assemble PR crisis management. There can be no important truth more than that if we are to have strength in our future. It is a strength that comes with diversity and the power of empathy that can only exist when the diverse are united in the honoring of facts, science, and human nuance. We have, in our varying degrees, all witnessed and experienced the coming together of people in times of tragedy. I know from my work in the disaster response field how much more valuable would be prevention than reactivity. The great prevention we should be looking for is in our everyday lives, working harder and harder to come together. In coming to speak with you tonight, it forced me to reflect on ways that I could do a better job at that. I went back into my head to December 2003. I was in Baghdad. It was my second trip there. I had gone once a year earlier. I remember pausing on the street and taking in the incredible damage to the infrastructure that city had suffered since I had last seen it. And then I remembered a mother walking her young child through traffic. And I remember at one point that young child cocking back his head to look up at his mother, to make sure he was okay, that he was safe with all the traffic around him. What I assumed to be a search for reassuring confidence in his mother's eyes. And then after they'd made it safely through the traffic to the other side of the street, that image of that little innocent boy looking upward became in my mind a snapshot of that same little boy looking up into the sky of that shocking force the night that had been our bombers spreading our conception of democracy. The size of that horror, that shock and awe, that it must have embedded in that child, boggles my greatest efforts of imagination. Kind of a humbling moment for this American boy. These are the moments I will remind myself of more and more when I look to bicker and brood. There's never been a time where we are more called upon to mobilize and recalibrate our senses to fight from being consumed by the normalization of this perversion of our shared culture and sensibilities. There's not simply a threat to that our institutions will be corroded, but worse, that we might come to accept this all as a normal state of things, leaving our moral aspirations to a waste pile. Unaccountability is the devil that's been released. And to be clear, it's not just Republicans. Arrogant activists and politicians on all sides sit on pulpits and Bibles of belligerence, justifying whatever collateral damage their one-dimensional mission of self-popularization may demand. The dark insinuations by the Trumpist right suggesting Jamal Khashoggi a radical Islamist, even otherwise like-minded people cannibalizing and defaming each other in the flick of a tweet. In this era of ubiquitous cyber accessibility, popular movements are as likely to invite the influence of those seeking personal stature and plaudits as those for whom a movement seeks a greater and more sustainable result. President Trump is not the first and will not be the last abuser of this vulnerable culture we've created for ourselves. Our enemies, most wicked, are increasingly internal. The wealth of our country, in many ways, is an insobering luxury of perspective, especially for those posturing within it who might tolerate the dog whistles of bigotry as though a means to a greater end. We're clawing our way through a cold civil war toward that tipping point that could indeed create a previously unimagined and archaic anarchy in our modern country. Sheep following sheep into an opportunity to create superficial blondes of flippant intolerance. we need to look no farther than that which is the renewed and strengthened movement against gender inequality. And when I talk about movement, I am not referring to angry voices and a hashtag and a catchphrase. I'm referring to that which is at once an emphatic plea for the raising of conscience and the fair demand for equality in our human community. But when a Democratic U.S. Senator addresses this community's gender discourse with the words, "Men should just shut up," it is no different than had she demanded the same of Arab Americans or Muslims at large in the discourse of the era immediately following 9/11. However, when a young woman's plea for when young women plead their personal cases to another U.S. senator, named after a Republican, in an elevator, demanding his connection with all that pain and courage in their hearts, we are forced to stand in his shoes and move with those brave women just a little bit forward. I do not know if Dr. Blasey Ford does or does not personally choose to identify with what has become popularly known as the Me Too movement. But I would suggest that her impact and courage as an individual human and woman might have had deeper and more lasting results and been less impinged upon had the media and others not ubiquitously wrapped her in a flag blind to its own divisiveness, and instead offered similarly inclusive persuasion. Let's remember that it was January 21, 2016, when the extraordinary Women's March descended on Washington, D.C., its attendance of solidarity dwarfing our current president's inauguration crowd on that same day. This rejuvenated, historic, and righteous women's movement had well established itself by the time Me Too arrived later in October. And I would argue a skepticism toward Me Too's zealotous way while being fully supportive of its why. I have been principally an actor by trade, a trade arguably among those centrally challenged to objectively observe those threads most honest and deceptive in human nature. My experience in this is long. My aptitude, I will leave at your discretion. That said, I do not recall in my life ever observing another human individual speak at such length as Dr. Blasey Ford during her congressional testimony, where virtually every moment fulfilled everything I know of human honesty at such an intellectual level. This individual was to me so much more productive and powerful in the nuance of her truthfulness than any 10,000 random and temperamental tweets of a pact that, yes, often have destroyed other innocent lives. In any effort to diffuse discrimination, it would be sound thinking, rather than to overwhelm enemies, to welcome their better angels. I am the son of a World War II hero who was blacklisted in the country he risked his life for only a few short years earlier. The culture of blacklisting is so rejuvenated under the leadership of President Trump, and it's an area of his influence that too many among his opposition have dumbly adopted as if at his bidding. At what age do we learn to discriminate? At what age are we expected to question discrimination? How long after a traumatic assault are we expected to speak up or report it? Some of this, and importantly so, can be answered by legislation, both existing legislation as well as additional legislations that we will know as we grow. But if we outgrow inclusion and mutual empathy, we will do so despite legislation. We will ignore intellectual honesty, celebrate ego, and devolve into a culture of punitive electronics. With all the benefits that come of technology, the science, the possibilities of communication, it also makes us more vulnerable than ever to propaganda and defamation. When we are invited into political zealotry, we've got to work harder to resist it. We get swept up in trends of black and white that lose track of either solutions or compassionate insight. We want to be right. We want to be seen as being right. But we're not right, are we? Not if we don't look deeper in ourselves tomorrow than we did yesterday. All of us. Because otherwise, what will it have gotten us? Another bad actor making a speech. No, I was talking about the president. But that's what's so profoundly important about missions like yours, missions like that of ADC, missions that may force us all to evolve forward out of bigotry and bravado and see our way clearer to seeing each other. One large, multicolored, multi-ethnic group of individual human beings, men, women, or however any among us individuals might themselves identify. We've got to be more humble and more human, despite everything pulling us out of our skins, human enough to consider our responsibility when a Raytheon shell falls on Yemen. Our responsibility when Monsanto seeds poison children, here or abroad. Our responsibility to a climate growing warmer and a nation's heart growing colder. We're all flawed people. But if we can just be a little bit better each day, a little more compassionate, a bit more educated, and a lot more accountable, we might break the cycle yet. We vote change into power, and we hold the feet of those figures of change to the fire that it can legitimately let us all join together in saying, America is great. I'm here today because you all at the ADC have been here for so many years doing just that, working to make change and greatness. The voices of tolerant Arab Americans are more important today than perhaps ever before, as the United States seems increasingly bent on a nationalism disconnecting it from the rest of the world. Our understanding of Arab culture will diminish at a time it most needs to grow, not only in the noble fight against discrimination, but also as a matter of national security. And what is the difference between national security and anti-discrimination? At its core, nothing. There is no difference. Our recognition of each other as equally American, be we black, white, brown, gay, straight, men, women, Arabs, Jews, Christian, atheists, rich, poor, immigrants, or American-born, is essential. that we be understood, unstereotyped, and celebrated for the American brothers and sisters we are, because that's the reality of who we are, not this surreal thing we've been buying into. We've just seen another coupling of record-breaking storms hit and take lives in our country. We've got to embrace science and each other, each of us in any way we can. I'm quite sure that I'm in a room full of people who need no reminder to vote next month. But if there's one takeaway I'd offer you, it would be to take out that little black mirror in your pocket for the good use of it and encourage your voting age children to get out there and vote too. So I know it's been a long night, so I'll sum it up. I suppose part of the reason that I was asked here tonight, and I think it's become known, if it wasn't before to many of you, that I've traveled many of the countries of North Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia, and seen the places and met with people in many of your countries of origin or ancestry. I'm sure, in fact, that many of you still keep homes, have family in the Arab world. When I look back on my own travels, might be better like this after all this time. When I look back on my own travels there, despite some being fraught with war and conflict, the strongest impression that I'm left with, even beyond the richness of culture and history, is first and foremost the warmth, kindness, brotherhood, and hospitality that I was offered over and over again by Arab fathers, mothers, and their children, in equal measure by those thriving as those barely surviving. Those have been moving encounters for me. So for that, I say thank you. Thank you, ADC. Thank you, my friend Ilikawam. Thank you all. We march on. Good night.